As someone who's been exposed to a lot of horror, whether it be movies, TV, video games, cultured shit, as I'm gonna tastefully call it, I don't often get scared when watching horror-related art anymore, at least not as much as I used to. I think it's because I grew up watching so much of this stuff, and I was much more sensitive to scary things when I was younger, so I don't easily get frightened watching or playing pure horror anymore. Don't get me wrong, I still get creeped out and have some emotional reactions when exposing myself to new horror media that gets released, but I don't often feel any sense of fear or dread when experiencing a pure horror narrative. I love horror more in terms of the types of stories they can tell, or the metaphorical themes they can communicate, or even the cool special effects they can show off. But except for a few films that still constantly frighten me every time I watch them, I don't get much out of horror art in terms of the pure scare factor. And that's why I'm making this video, because when it comes to the art that genuinely leaves me with a sense of dread, it's less pure horror films and more stuff that masquerades itself as something else, but then ends up being a lot more frightening and haunting than I anticipated. Basically, what I'm saying is that if you want to scare me, just fucking clickbait my ass. Speaking of clickbait, let's talk about some horror directors who cheekily squeezed in horror shit in major Hollywood blockbusters just to prank your goofy, gullible ass. Part A, spooky directors do be prankin'. I feel like I would be doing a disservice to both this section and the video if I didn't mention the GOAT of spooky directors who do be prankin', Sam Raimi. Sam Raimi is one of my favorite directors. I mean, Evil Dead 2 alone makes him worthy of that title. Part of what I love about Raimi's filmmaking approach and that in most of the projects he works on, he kind of just does Evil Dead shit even when he's not required to. I mean, honestly, do you think the bigwigs at Sony were the ones who walked on the set of Spider-Man 2 and said, "Hey Sam, we know you're making this big budget superhero sequel, but as part of our corporate mandate, can you also squeeze in, I don't know, one of the most frightening PG-13 horror sequences in all of blockbuster cinema?" Like, no, fuck that shit. Sam Raimi included this terrifying Doc Ock hospital horror scene because he fucking felt like it. And boy, I'm glad that he did, because with no exaggeration, this is not only the best scene in the entire film, but it's also just one of the best scenes in all of superhero cinema. Now, I'm not gonna go super in-depth about this hospital scene because, let's be real, you're just as intimately familiar with this sequence as I am. We all know just how well shot, edited, and staged this sequence is, as well as just how intense and guttural those screams are. Nerdwriter has a great video breaking down this sequence if you want a more in-depth analysis, but the point that I want to communicate is that part of what makes this moment so terrifying, especially on the first watch, is how it just kind of comes out of nowhere. Now, the first Spider-Man film did play around with a lot of scary imagery because, again, it's Sam Raimi directing, but there isn't anything in that film that I would call horror. I mean, except this part.
Are you in or are you out?
You're fucking scared me when you say shit like that. Stop!
And I think that's what makes this moment just so fucking effective, because it completely catches you off guard. Up until this moment, it kind of plays out just like any other superhero sequel, so when it throws you this gigantic curveball, it's a huge surprise. But because it's so effectively pulled off, it's also a welcome one. And on the topic of sneaking in a cheeky little horror scene just to randomly scare the crap out of you, let's talk about another horror director turned high-budget action blockbuster filmmaker, Peter Jackson. Jackson started his career sort of the same way Sam Raimi did, in that he made these very cheap horror comedy gore fests with stuff like Bad Taste and Brain Dead / Dead Alive. But unlike Raimi, who has continued to do Evil Dead shit in most of his subsequent films, Jackson kind of did the opposite as he started moving away from his more horror roots, especially today, since he's just making documentaries, which, to be honest, are pretty great, and I highly recommend you check them out. However, even though he's now become synonymous as this big-budget spectacle director who made that trilogy of nerd stories you've probably never heard of, he still occasionally likes sneaking in bits of spookiness and scares into his films. For example... Now, as funny as that meme is, to give it some credit, it did scare 7-year-old me when I first watched it, so much so that I didn't want to watch the rest of the movie. But jokes aside, there aren't a lot of horror elements in Lord of the Rings. There's a lot of creepy imagery for sure, but nothing I would consider a horror sequence. If anything, I feel like the films that have way more horror shit would be something like his remake of King Kong, or Heavenly Creatures even. Let's start with King Kong. Everyone knows about plus-sized Harambe. Everyone knows he likes beating the shit out of dinosaurs and committing domestic terrorism before 9/11 made it cool. While Peter Jackson's version prioritizes being this huge special effects-driven blockbuster, there will occasionally be a moment in which the film randomly just decides to be a horror movie. There are lots of moments where it genuinely becomes kind of terrifying, like these racist stereotypes of the native islanders, for example. But when I think of scary scenes in King Kong, the first thing I really think of is the one where Andy Serkis gets eaten by those penis worms. Even though the CG in this bug scene is dated and kind of jank, it doesn't take away just how frightening it is. Seeing Andy Serkis get his head swallowed whole by one of the penis worms and then slowly getting bitten to death by the other worms as he suffers a slow death is admittedly scary to watch, and what makes this moment even scarier is the lack of any bombastic or overt horror music. It just kind of presents this as it is, and the fact that there's this eerie quietness while the crew is attacked by the giant bugs and penis worms helps makes this an effectively scary sequence. Similarly, in Heavenly Creatures, there are plenty of moments where the film just stops in its tracks to become a horror film. From the scene where Pauline dancing with the clay statues gets cut back and forth with her being railed by this simp, to this moment where Pauline has a fantasy about her parents suffering horrible deaths, to this surprisingly scary bit where Orson Welles chases after Pauline and Juliet as if he's this spooky-ass slasher villain or some shit. There is some dark humor in many of these moments, but it still doesn't change just how intense they can be at times. Anyway, the main thing I want you to take away from this section is that horror directors tend to make very interesting films when they're working on non-horror projects, especially if they happen to be big-budget sci-fi, fantasy, action blockbusters. They might not always deliver great movies, but at the very least they'll make something that kind of stands out visually and isn't just the same sloppy Joe school lunch dog shit. For example, Aquaman is not a good movie, but it's still a fun and entertaining one because James Wan directed it. You can see how his experience working on horror films really helped him out, because some of the best moments in this movie are just when it becomes a big budget horror film. The trench scene stands out in particular because of how surprisingly gory and bloody it is, especially within the context of a PG-13 superhero movie. Speaking of movies that shouldn't be scary but still end up being kind of terrifying, let's move on to the next section. Part 2. Turns out war is bad. Now, at first glance, it might be weird to bring war films into the same conversation that includes, I don't know, Spider-Man 2 and King Kong, especially within the context of this being a Halloween-themed horror video, but hear me out. When I think of some of the best and most effective war films that really connect and emotionally resonate with me, they're the ones that feel less like war movies and more like horror films that just happen to have guns and explosions and shit. In case you aren't aware, but war and the ever-present threat of dying are not fun. These are immensely and existentially terrifying things, and the fact that Hollywood and other major studios spanning various countries have turned something as inherently frightening as war into entertainment is kind of bullshit. The fact that there's even this notion of a generic war film is already absurd. I shouldn't go into dipshit movies like these and expect some grand-scale action movie epicness where cool guys can shoot their guns and huge battalions of soldiers crash into each other and do some sick-ass battles, except maybe Inglourious Bastards, but that's a completely different example. To me, an effective and well-constructed war film should not leave me feeling excitement or adrenaline or even patriotism. It should make me scared as shit. A great anti-war film should authentically capture the emotional and psychological horror that comes with fighting in the front lines and participating in these devastating conflicts without feeling exploitative. For example, Come and See has long been hailed as the greatest anti-war film ever made, and just simply one of the greatest movies of all time. And a big reason as to why it has become so beloved amongst critics and cinephiles is just how psychologically scarring the film's imagery and approach to violence is. This is a film that does not hold back. It is an unrelenting nightmare that will constantly remind you of not only just how fucked everything is, but also how all of it is taking this massive toll on the main character mentally, emotionally, and especially physically. I mean, look at this picture of the main character in the beginning of the film, and look at this picture of him at the end of the film. It's like he went through his own fucking beach that makes you old, except this beach is called the bombarded Belarusian fields, filled to the brim with death and destruction caused by the Nazis. The last 30 to 45 minutes of Come and See are some of the most traumatic shit I've ever seen. Watching these Nazi soldiers cram all these innocent people into a barn cabin like they're sardines, taunting them that they can go free if they leave their children behind, and then gleefully burning it to the ground is just fucking horrifying. There is so much awful shit in this sequence, from the photo taken with the Nazi soldiers holding a gun at the main character's head, to casually throwing a child back into the barn when it escapes, to dragging a woman by her hair. The first time I watched this film, and this sequence in particular, I was traumatized because not only is all this shit in of itself fucking terrifying, but it also serves as a powerful reminder of the real-life atrocities that the Nazis committed while fighting in the Eastern Front. This war film is genuinely scarier than most horror films I've seen, and even though I've only seen it once, so much of what happens in Come and See is still burned into my memory. However, while I do consider Come and See to be the GOAT of using film to showcase the existential dread and traumatizing horrors of war, there are plenty of other great anti-war movies that also do a fantastic job selling their message. Threads is one example that comes to mind, as this is a film that does not hold back in unveiling the bleak and brutal reality of how society crumbles and human values get thrown out the window when nuclear holocaust breaks out. This is an incredibly dark film that provides a realistic portrayal of what would happen to us as a species if nuclear fallout occurred. And speaking of a world of shit, Full Metal Jacket is a movie that explores exactly that. I could have come up with a better transition, but whatever, we're rolling with it. If you've seen the movie, you know what I'm referencing. Full Metal Jacket is essentially a horror film pretending to be a war film, because at the end of the day, part of what makes this movie, in my opinion, the greatest artistic exploration into the Vietnam War is just how much this conflict mentally fucked up the lives of young American troops like Joker, Cowboy, and especially Pyle. Arguably the scariest moment in this entire film features a scene that doesn't feature war at all. It's before the young recruits are shipped off to Vietnam, and that's the iconic bathroom scene. Full Metal Jacket is a film about how the American soldiers who fought in Vietnam are nothing more than cogs in a machine. The US military treats these young recruits with nothing but utter contempt and discipline because they want to rip out any humanity they have inside and transform them into administrators of death praying for war, as Sergeant Hartman says in the beginning of the film. And the earliest person that becomes such a brain-dead, heartless killer is Private Pyle. This is a character who has essentially been beaten down emotionally, psychologically, and even physically from his drill sergeant and his fellow recruits, and all this pummeling after pummeling strips away so much of his humanity that by the time he reaches the end of boot camp training, he's nothing more than an empty shell with this scary demonic look in his eyes. He is the cold, heartless killing machine that Hartman and the military so desperately wanted out of him. And what's the first thing he does as an official soldier? He guns down his drill sergeant before taking his own life. There is a lot of fucked up shit in Full Metal Jacket, from the introduction to the character of Animal Mother to the final scene where Joker begrudgingly guns down the child soldier that killed Cowboy while being applauded by his fellow troops. This is a film that does not sugarcoat nor hide how fucking traumatic and scary war is, especially in terms of what it does to a person. And the fact that this is only Kubrick's second best war film goes to show just how masterful of a filmmaker he is and why I consider him my favorite director. But anyway, let's get off this depressing gravy train and finally move on to a happier point: anime. Part I. Anime can be scary too. Who am I kidding? This shit is also gonna be a bit of a bummer, but hey, at least we're not talking about genocidal Nazis and the dehumanization of war in this section, so fuck it, I consider this an absolute win. Anyway, I was originally gonna start this section with a huge-ass analysis of Perfect Blue, because not only is it in my top 10 favorite movies of all time, but it's one of the few pieces of art, not just anime, that leaves me terrified every time I watch it. But one day I was scrolling through Letterboxd and discovered that the app classified this movie as horror, which meant that it was disqualified from this video. However, as much as I would have loved to have talked about Perfect Blue for like a fucking hour, I'm kind of glad that it got disqualified because, one, it means I can talk about other stuff, but also, two, I can now officially count it as a good horror anime, and the reason why that's such a big freaking dealio is because, frankly, there isn't a lot of good horror anime out there, or just horror anime in general. Mother's Basement has a good video explaining why there's such a drought in horror anime, so I'm not going to bore you with the details, but the main thing I want to communicate is that while there are creepy elements and imagery in plenty of anime shows and movies, that very rarely translates to shit that's actually scary. For example, anime like Hellsing Ultimate, Devilman Crybaby, and Vampire Hunter D have very gruesome gore and graphic imagery, but I don't consider any of those things horror because the actual horror elements are, at best, side salad for the actual genres these stories are interested in exploring. At the end of the day, these are dark fantasy action anime, and the actual horror-related shit is just there for aesthetic purposes more than anything, and sadly that's kind of how a lot of anime within the horror genre end up being, just gore fests that prop up other genres, and the times when an anime tries to be scary, they end up being kind of ass. I would love to say the Uzumaki anime, being the gigantic dumpster fire that it is right now, is a fluke, but unfortunately that tends to happen a lot, whether it's a Junji Ito adaptation or not. Oh wow, that fucking rhymed. I didn't even do that on purpose. That being said, horror in anime is not impossible, as there have been stuff that have scared the shit out of me and left me feeling terrified and full of dread, but I feel like a lot of those moments come not from horror anime, but anime and other genres that carry out like fucking normal before they jump out the bushes and sneak attack me with some frightening ass shit. Akira is a perfect example of this phenomenon, because the first time you watch this film, it's pretty much just this cool, sleek, cyberpunk action movie with sci-fi biker gangs whacking the shit out of each other, but as the film goes on, they start throwing in more fantastical and eerie elements in the mix, like these psychic geezer babies, and Tetsuo becoming a god by the film's third act, but again, nothing that screams horror. At least that is until the last 10 minutes, where the film essentially grinds to a halt and becomes this terrifying 2001: A Space Odyssey meets David Cronenberg body horror extravaganza, in which Tetsuo's body starts morphing into this disgusting pile of flesh and goop. It's a moment of body horror that really adds to this film's experience, and even on rewatches, it can be nightmarish to watch. Speaking of nightmarish watches, Cowboy Bebop is surprisingly another example of an anime that features a lot of effectively presented scares. There are 2 horror-centered episodes in Cowboy Bebop, one of which is called Toys in the Attic, which is this alien-inspired story in which moldy leftovers that were left in the fridge for a long-ass time pick off the characters left and right. And while this episode is creepy, the one that I truly find horrific is the one with Perot LeFou. Out of all the bad guys in Cowboy Bebop, this is the one I considered the most dangerous. He's sort of like Private Pile meets the Joker, in the sense that he's this cold, heartless killing machine with a child's brain who doesn't really give a shit about who he hurts or how badly. Now, ruthless killers are nothing new in this series, it's sort of par for the course in Cowboy Bebop, but what makes this character stand out is that he's the only one who managed to do what no other villain has done: scare Spike Spiegel. Spike is very much this nonchalant, badass, cool guy who keeps calm in even the most dire of situations, so the fact that we actively see him frightened by Perot LeFou shows how dangerous and unhinged this guy is. Also, taking aside the characters for a second, the way this scene is lit and presented also goes to show just how much Shinichiro Watanabe wanted to sell this episode as a horror one, and he does a great job, as this is the only episode in the entire show that I can say I was scared watching. However, we can't discuss anime that doesn't sell itself as horror but ends up being fucked up without at least briefly mentioning a little magical girl series called Madoka Magica. I consider this show to be one of the biggest clickbaits in all of anime, and I mean that with no exaggeration, because that's exactly what Shinbo, Gen Urobuchi, and the rest of those lunatics at Shaft did. When this anime was first announced, it was marketed as a cute, ooh-woo magical girl anime, where cute girls use their magic powers to fight monsters and shit in the same vein as Sailor Moon or whatever, and it starts that way at first, but by the 3rd episode, the show literally just stands up and says, "That's it, no more cute shit, fuck you," by having this giant cartoon monster eat a magical girl's head clean off. And what's especially fucked up about this scene, other than how it catches you off guard, is the lack of blood or any super explicit gore. I think it's because I've seen and been desensitized to so many anime shows that try to hammer home how edgy and bloody and violent they are, so seeing something so shocking, yet also framed in a way where your eyes and brain don't have the full context of such a violent death is, in my opinion, more terrifying than had it been explicitly shown. I love how rather than showing this character's corpse, Madoka Magica instead focuses on the character's reactions or the sudden disappearance of a spell she casted earlier. It's fucked up because this scene leaves this death up to your imagination, and in my opinion, implied horror and violence can be scarier than explicit horror and violence. And finally, I don't think I can end a discussion about horrifying anime that isn't technically horror without bringing up one of my favorite movies slash sources of PTSD ever, The End of Evangelion. The first time I watched this film as a teenager, I was so traumatized and terrified by what I was watching that I legitimately hesitated revisiting it at all in the future. It left an impression on me the same way Come and See did, in that both of these movies fucked me up so badly that I never wanted to watch them again, even though I consider both of them masterpieces and some of my favorite movies ever. Even when I rewatched this film for the second and third time in the year 2024 and have grown up so much since that first watch, those horrifying moments that were burned into my memory still scared the shit out of me. I still tensed the fuck up during that nightmarish fight scene where the mass-produced Evangelions stab Asuka's Eva and tear them into pieces like vultures feasting on a rotting corpse. I still have a fucking mental breakdown when the third impact happens and all the nerve agents explode into orange juice. Watching the scene where Maya explodes and her hand rolls across the table is particularly disturbing. The entire cosmic horror Lovecraftian sequence in which Giant Ray and the mass-produced Evas fucking obliterate the entire world as billions and billions of green crosses emit across the world made me want to curl up into a ball and die. Kinda like this pussy does 80% of the time. I've never been scared or fazed by any of those end is nigh chants and signs that crazy people like parading around with, but honestly, if the end does come, and it's as horrific as this shit, I might just go crazy too. For a movie that isn't technically a horror film, End of Evangelion is one of the scariest experiences I've ever had. And even though at the end of the day it's a reminder to have hope for yourself and your fellow humans, the road to salvation and redemption truly is fucked.
In conclusion,
Anyway, I've ranted to you guys like a delusional maniac long enough. I've given plenty of examples to back up my thesis, and yeah, I don't really have a solid conclusion to end this long-ass piece, so I'll just leave it at that. Believe it or not, this video was originally supposed to be even longer because I had like 3 other points and dozens of examples I wanted to get to. Like, I had entire sections planned out about David Fincher and Stanley Kubrick, for example, but I had to cut them for time, so if this video does well and you want to see a part 2 of this video, let me know in the comments, as I'd love to make a follow-up next Halloween. But anyway, that's all I got. If you're subscribed to my channel or plan on becoming a subscriber, then the next time you'll see me, it'll be when I talk about these Ghibli movies and then when I talk about hentai. Until then, peace.